This is a personal response to the policy statement published on the 20th of August 2021 by the new coalition of the Scottish National Party, also referred to as the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Green Party. I will deal only with policies likely to affect the future of salmon aquaculture, marine protection measures and interactions between them. Hello, I'm James Merriweather, a biologist, an ecologist in the scientific sense, and therefore a scientist who is anxious to ensure that the natural world shall continue its magnificent 3.5 billion year existence, along with the evolved diversity and interactions of its millions of living organisms. I'm also anxious, and I repeat the word deliberately because action is urgent, to see us humans behave more responsibly within that natural world, an impossible ambition I know because of who we are. But surely when it's obvious we're messing up, we can take steps to behave more responsibly than we are doing. We have reached a stage of civilization at which we have the capacity to attack, weaken and even destroy components of the world we live in, the home upon which we depend for our very existence and survival. We're routinely destructive even when, ultimately, we are likely to disadvantage ourselves. What's the point of pulling the carpet from under our feet when with a little consideration and organisation we can devise ways to leave it in place and tread gently? I don't want to condemn fish farming across the board, but from my vantage point in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, making good use of my time, eyes, camera and brain, I can tell that farming salmon in nets at sea is imposing unacceptable detrimental impacts on the sea that surrounds us, which to a significant extent sustains us. Salmon farming is a reckless activity that demonstrably, indeed obviously if we make the effort to learn and understand the evidence, is damaging marine and adjacent ecosystems. While carelessly exploiting the natural environment, salmon farming makes a few people extremely rich, a few more quite wealthy, and provides some modestly paid employment. But at what cost? I've explored the risks and costs of salmon farming in greater detail in a series of YouTube presentations available at the Ochtatire Academy channel. Links in the notes below. It would cause us little inconvenience to do without farmed salmon. Wild Atlantic salmon is an energetic, migratory, predatory fish with a complicated life cycle. Its nature and lifestyle make it one of the least suitable fish for farming, particularly since farmed salmon has wild relatives which we might prefer to eat. But they are all in tragic decline and on the brink of extinction, largely because of salmon farming. If anybody benefits from the farm stuff at all, it's industry bosses who make fat profits and consumers persuaded that the convenient and cheap product is luxury food. And B, it's actually inferior, but with no real salmon left to compare it with, who would know? And the situation is much more complicated, indeed much worse than this brief introduction allows. The status quo in salmon aquaculture is not just not an option, it's absurd and it's dangerous. The subtitle of this presentation, "The Status Quo is Not an Option," was coined in a 2018 inquiry report produced by the Scottish Parliament's Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, ECCLR, and has proved very useful in our campaigning. 3 major documents emerged from the inquiry: that report from the Environment Committee, later a report from the Rural Economy Committee, and a study provided by the Scottish Association for Marine Science that informed both committees in their deliberations. The original author of the phrase was Graham Day, MSP, convener of the meeting, who wrote the report. This fundamental aphorism was never spoken during the meeting, but it was inserted conspicuously deliberately at this pivotal point in its conclusions. Next, it was repeated 6 times, paraphrased, in the Rural Economy Committee's report. But extraordinarily, when the inquiry was debated in Parliament, the status quo is not an option was quoted 12 times by several MSPs. Evidently, this carefully worded advice had some impact in Parliament. And of course it's continued to do so outside Parliament. Significantly, certainly surprisingly considering his views on the matter, even the Economy Cabinet Secretary repeated the status quo is not an option, a soundbite to treasure if with little confidence that it meant very much.
We do need to do more to get the balance right to protect the environment And we acknowledge that the status quo is not an option.
Seconds earlier, Mr Ewing had said,
and I want to make it absolutely clear, this government's support for the farm salmon and wider aquaculture sectors and their sustainable growth.
we all know how the meaning of sustainable has evolved and can nowadays refer either to care for the marine environment or, should the user choose, support for the aquaculture industry. We're obliged to apply a cynical analysis of context to understand what is actually meant.
We do need to do more to get this government's support for the farm salmon, the environment and wider aquaculture sectors, and that their sustainable growth is not an option.
What exactly happened in response to the parliamentary inquiry? As critical observers, as far as we can tell, business as usual. The Scottish Government's policy promoting doubling the size and output of salmon farming by 2030 with no attempt to reform the method used, that is, ignoring the advice that emerged from the inquiry, the non-optional status quo, persisted. On the 20th of August 2021, the Scottish National Party, SNP, and the Scottish Green Party, SGP, agreed on a coalition, publishing a shared policy programme which included policy statements for both aquaculture, salmon farming in particular, and protection of the marine environment. Notably, they restated the now familiar aphorism, I quote, "The status quo of aquaculture regulation is not an option. The exact detail of the status quo in salmon farming can be checked and verified with reference to the reports from the 2018 parliamentary inquiry. Here I will take each policy item in turn and express my opinions. They are, of course, my personal opinions, but I'm reasonably confident that my colleagues will not disagree." The aquaculture section covers less than a page, but the points it raises seem to tackle head-on the reform for which we are campaigning. Whether or not these policies will be enacted, literally or after methodical reinterpretation, remains to be seen. Next, under the heading Marine Protection, the policy statement is substantially longer. Parts of it are directly relevant with regard to the reform of salmon farming. From the very first sentence of this aquaculture policy statement, we must be aware of weasel words. I'm confident that the SNP-SGP policymakers had no deceitful intent when using such words, but salmon farming has adopted them as ambiguosities, euphemisms, and stealthy mind control agents, so that they really ought to be avoided. The worst by far and always is sustainable, along with its cousin sustainability. Depending on intent, sustainable can have multiple meanings. Example: Scott Lansborough, ex-CEO of the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, interviewed by Tom Heap on BBC's Countryfile in 2013, said,
"We want to have a sustainable industry here. It is a challenge, but it's a challenge for the wild fish."
To many people, the mere mention of the word sustainable automatically conjures up associations with nature conservation, while in this instance, Lansborough is actually referring to the sustaining of his industry. Ambiguous and misleading terminology is commonplace in conversations about salmon farming. Another weasel word, also spoken here in our example, is challenge.
We want to have a sustainable industry here. It is a challenge, but it's a challenge for the wild fish.
Inserted to tone down more strident words like problem, disaster, failure, fiasco, and so on. There are several other of these weasel words that contain premeditated misunderstanding potential. Here, Pristine appeals to our nostalgia by referring to the original unspoilt pre-salmon pollution condition of fish farm sites, which could have been up to 20 or even 30 years ago. To be fair, only sustainable has crept into this document, and then by common convention, any hint of deception left to other users. Let's examine the text of the joint aquaculture policy, about which both parties have agreed that the status quo is not an option. I'll not apologise for repeating or alluding to the phrase many times, each time it becomes a relevant talking point. Aquaculture. The Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party believe that Scotland should have a sustainable, diverse, competitive and economically viable aquaculture industry. I doubt that in this context it's intended to mislead, But here already is our favourite weasel word, sustainable, in the very first sentence. However, it should not be automatically assumed to carry solely environmental connotations, whereas in
we want to have a sustainable industry here.
It certainly represents the industry's point of view. Let us generously presume that in this instance, sustainable aquaculture industry carries an inclusive environment and industry connotation. Also, we shouldn't be misled by diverse, which here has nothing to do with biodiversity. I suppose it's referring to aquacultural product diversity, salmon, trout, rainbow trout, mussels, oysters, etc. But once more, a critical analysis might be advisable. On its face, the sentence seems to be a straightforward promise, but when closely examined it might turn out to be almost meaningless. And we must read on critically to see what the rest of the statement says to substantiate or refute our reservations. Reading on, the aquaculture industry must operate within environmental limits and with social licence and ensure there is a thriving marine ecosystem for future generations. To me, with social licence, strongly suggests community involvement, a privilege promised by the Community Empowerment Act Scotland of 2015, but to my knowledge not noticeably implemented. But then, ensure there is a thriving marine ecosystem for future generations? It's a fine aspiration, but something that salmon farmers will never be able to accomplish so long as they persist with their filthy methodology, rearing their fishes in nets at sea. Reform and rigorous regulation will be the only way to reinstate a thriving, stable, natural marine ecosystem in Scottish coastal waters. Without, this fundamental policy could fail completely. Continuing, and this paragraph surely commits the Scottish Government to implementing reform of the salmon aquaculture industry in accordance with its own parliamentary inquiry's conclusions and recommendations. We agree with the Scottish Parliament's REC and ECCLR committees that the status quo of aquaculture regulation is not an option. The status quo is not an option, and the option they suggest here is regulation, which we would qualify with reform. Yes, both parties recognise and agree with the conclusion of the 2018 parliamentary inquiry that, just for once, I need not and will not bother to say it out loud. Oh look, there it is anyway. We will reform the regulatory and planning framework, starting with an independent review to consider the effectiveness and efficiency of the current regime and make recommendations for further work by the end of 2021. An independent review? I hope we can expect this review not to disagree with the review already conducted, that parliamentary inquiry. The upcoming review was announced by numerous agencies, here in the industry's own magazine, Fish Farmer. After stagnation over the 3 years since the parliamentary inquiry, does this promise action that will ensure reform? We shall see, but reservations have already been expressed and questions raised. Does the open-minded Professor Griggs truly have unbiased understanding of salmon farming or any appreciation of the ecological harm it causes? Will the review body come under the influence of the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation? No doubt they'll try it on. The industry provides, says Fish Farmer, a source of homegrown, nutritious, low-carbon protein that is enjoyed at home and abroad. First, and satirically of course, hey, forgive me, I am going to keep my pedantic lips buttoned about the upcoming split infinitive. With a carbon content of over 43%, protein is not low carbon. And seriously, as the public becomes aware of the problems with farmed salmon and stop buying it, it is becoming enjoyed at home and abroad less and less. This lady's comment during a demonstration outside an M&S store in England sounds very familiar. Family and friends, even strangers with whom I have shared my relatively recently acquired knowledge about salmon farming would tell a very similar story. And none of us eat farmed salmon.
My sister works for an organisation in Scotland trying to stop a salmon farm being built. It was only because of her that I realised how bad the practices are. We should make people aware of that.
Information shared can change minds. If the message is clear and plausible, there's no need for underhand persuasion tactics. Just tell the people and let them decide. Returning to the text, we will consider the effectiveness and efficiency of the current regime. Of course, the current regime has already been shown to be woefully inadequate, so I hope this is a given. We will develop a vision and strategy for sustainable aquaculture that places an enhanced emphasis on environmental protection and community benefits. Here it is again, sustainable aquaculture. The term can be so very ambiguous, though here there can be little doubt it's qualified with environmental protection. They better mean and enact what we interpret this policy to mean, and they'd be well advised to take notice of information provided by well-informed campaigners, of whom there are many, their expert advice freely available. For instance, here is one of our number, John Aitchison, representing one of the numerous concerned Scottish coastal community groups, Friends of the Sound of Jura. He was called as one of the witnesses in the Environment Committee's deliberations in the 2018 parliamentary inquiry. His well-informed, evidence-based testimony was in no small part responsible for the committee's ultimate conclusion that, well, you know the adage, because he provided data and sound arguments.
John Aitchison.
This is welcome, but it's been forced by the Information Commissioner enforcing a decision which the government refused to do, which was to publish this data because the industry said they didn't want to initially. But it's good that it's happening now. But what the aggregate data that there's been before has concealed is the massive spikes of sea lice in many farms. For instance, one in Shetland has 20 sea lice, adult female sea lice per fish, when the threshold for action is 8, and 8 very high. The threshold for action used to be 1, so that was the Code of Good Practice threshold for action. So if those spikes, those are the ones that are doing the biggest harm, and that information needs to be not just published but acted on instantly and something done about it, because the billions of sea lice larvae produced by those farms kill sea trout and damage and kill salmon.
Scotland has many well-informed academic campaigners for salmon aquaculture reform. The Scottish Government and its agencies should consider calling upon their expertise not occasionally, but as a routine. It's worth keeping in mind that aquaculture industry spokespersons and staff present opinions driven by an obligation to defend their career and income. Conversely, arguments presented by anti-salmon farming campaigners who do not have financial interests or expect remuneration are informed and inspired entirely by evidence, allowing for objectivity and impartiality. Back to the list. We will begin an immediate programme of work to better protect wildlife and the environment. Wow! Can that promise be misinterpreted? The parliamentary inquiry raised our hopes, later dashed by government inaction, but this does seem to be the sort of promise we have long been campaigning for. Let's try to be optimistic. But do they realise that to achieve that goal, nets must be abolished? That's the bottom line, and it truly is a big ask. We will explore how best to ensure that fish farming contributes more to support communities and recreational fisheries. The first part here is a bit vague, though we might hope that it's intended to convey implicit or oblique reference to the Communities Empowerment Act Scotland of 2015, which in its turn will have benefits for us. As for the proposed contribution of fish farming to the support of recreational fisheries, we need say no more than stop farming salmon in nets at sea. It's the net-cage salmon farms that have played a significant role in the near extinction worldwide of wild salmon and sea trout that constitute those now mostly defunct recreational fisheries. See my video about fish farm sea lice and read reports about disease epidemics in salmon farms that infect and kill their wild cousins. That's not a challenge, that's a catastrophe. Having appraised the joint aquaculture policy item by item, let's have a look at the Marine Protection Policy Statement. Marine protection. The Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party believe that the marine environment should be clean, healthy, safe, productive and diverse, and manage to meet the long-term needs of nature and people. Anybody disagree? As part of this vision, we are determined to make step change in marine protection and to deliver on our shared commitment to achieve and maintain good environmental status for all of Scotland's seas, offshore and inshore. Anybody object? We specifically commit to restoring marine habitats in Scotland's inshore waters with the aim of achieving good environmental status, recognising that those waters contain an array of rich marine wildlife and biodiversity. There are two fundamentally important points here. First, we specifically commit to restoring marine habitats in Scotland's inshore waters. The inshore waters are precisely where the salmon farms are sited, where marine habitats are being degraded by them by smothering with solid waste, an astonishing 1,000 tonnes per farm per annum, and that's industry data, intoxication, acknowledged by SEPA research, and eutrophication, an inevitable ecological response to enrichment by dissolved salmon excreted ammonia and phosphate. We'll have to hold the politicians' feet to the fire so they really do take steps to remove the main causes of threat to that array of rich marine wildlife and biodiversity, salmon farming and seabed trawling. This policy provides an unequivocal, specific commitment to restoring marine habitats, and I must say it again, the practical way to achieve that is the abolition of net cage salmon farming and seabed trawling. Considering the assault that has been and is being waged upon Scottish coastal seas, the need for these reforms is urgent. Since it has been and is agreed that the status quo is not an option, I propose that this commitment and all of its implicit intentions represents the new status quo for the regulation of salmon farming. We will deliver the suite of HPMAs through a policy and selection framework. HPMAs will be highly protected marine areas which we might hope will provide protection superior to or replacing existing marine protected areas. MPAs exist, but there seems to be little protection of them from illegal and detrimental practices that continue to cause their ecological deterioration. All of the 5 bulleted promises are important, but 2 are fundamental to the recovery of marine biodiversity. The imperative for salmon farming reform, as recommended, it seems quite a long time ago, by the 2018 Parliamentary Inquiry, must be implemented. Salmon farming is harmful to marine ecosystems, and if it is to continue, it must convert from nets to closed containment, that is, tanks. The final paragraph states a policy which will require rigorous implementation. Improved public engagement at all key stages would be a significant contribution to community participation and empowerment. Let's consider once more that apparently solid commitment to salmon aquaculture reform. With its many encouraging promises of radical changes in aquaculture practice and marine protection, this document surely signifies a, dare I say it, sustainable future for the Scottish coastal marine environment? I do hope so. If anybody still wants to deny the science that's proven the causal link between sea lice generated by salmon farms and catastrophic declines in wild salmon, here's more, albeit alternative, evidence. At present it's just a very persuasive, trustworthy observation, but you can be sure that data-based confirmation will soon be published in top scientific journals. Dr. Alex Morton has just published a YouTube video expressing her delight at nature's response to a decision by the Canadian government to forbid the restocking of salmon farms installed for many years among the Discovery Islands between Vancouver Island and the mainland. In response to pressure from the First Nations people of the region, last year the salmon farms were at last closed down. All of the 19 salmon farms in the Discovery Islands region were simply refused permission to restock, effectively closed. In consequence, the sea lice that had been plaguing the farmed and wild salmon simply vanished within less than a year.
So for the first time in probably 30 years, the young salmon are going to sea unharmed. They're going through waters that are nurturing them rather than killing them.
So please watch the video and hope that more closures will follow in the rest of Canada and around the world. If we must have farmed salmon, it's got to be up to the aquaculture industry to adopt methods that separate their pest and disease-ridden, polluting farms from the marine environment. Mitigation measures already exist, claimed by the industry to be unproven and too expensive. Neither is true. Land-based farms are already in production, and the old-fashioned salmon farming companies are very, very rich, having enjoyed half a century of waste disposal completely free of cost and conscience. The time has come for them to make real their until now utterly dishonest boast of responsible, sustainable production. For nature's sake, it's time for them to adopt closed containment.
So what this teaches us is that when you take the salmon farms out, the lice disappear. No farms, no lice.
Why should the status quo not be an option? The inquiry reports set the reasons out clearly, and their conclusions agree largely with us campaigners. Here are just some of those reasons from a biologist member of the public's point of view. Here's the complete list of the problems, that's disasters, not challenges, caused by farming Atlantic salmon in nets at sea. It's shocking, don't you agree? All except 2 items would be eliminated by the implementation of a single mitigation measure: abolish the nets. To put it mildly, the aquaculture industry won't like it, but the Scottish marine and freshwater environments will be grateful at every level. The Scottish Government calls for collective action to help hit net zero. That's fine, let's do that. But how about, while we're at it, collective action to help hit zero nets? Our optimistic expectation is that the Scottish Government's policy for growth of the aquaculture industry that currently omits reference to the disgraced status quo will be replaced by this joint SNP-SGP policy which fully recognises that the status quo is not an option. Reform can be achieved with a simple, if very difficult to navigate, end of salmon farming in nets. How else the aquaculture industry will choose to farm salmon is its own concern, but hopefully it will cease raising 2 fingers to its innocent host, the Scottish marine environment, which would probably gain them the gratitude of the Scottish people, while allowing the salmon farming reform campaigners to return to normal life and leisure.